The Vance family estate stood like a monument to old money and older secrets. White columns rising against Carolina blue skies, sweeping oak trees casting lace-patterned shadows across manicured lawns that had been maintained by the same groundskeeper for 40 years. I was 17 then, standing on the veranda with my grandmother's hand in mine, listening to her tell stories about the archive. These documents, Willow, my grandmother Eleanor, yes, my mother took her name, said, her papery fingers tracing the leather spine of a century-old ledger, are the heartbeat of this family. Not the money. Not the estate. These. She tapped the archive with the reverence usually reserved for scripture. These are proof that the Vances built something real. Something that mattered. I was the kind of girl who listened to her grandmother. While my older sister Victoria was perfecting her smile and calculating her advantages, I was learning that history was written in margins and footnotes, in the careful handwriting of architects and chemists who believed their work would outlive them. They were right. Grandmother showed me the ledgers, beautiful, bound volumes filled with chemical formulas in precise Victorian script. The Emberstone formulas. She'd inherited them from her great-grandfather, an innovative architectural chemist who developed a revolutionary fire-resistant stone used exclusively in the most prestigious historical restorations across the Northeast. But by the 1980s the family had forgotten what they had. They saw only storage trunks and dusty paper. Someday, grandmother said, squeezing my hand, someone in this family will remember these matter. Someone will understand their true value. I was 18 when grandmother died. I was also 18 when I lost everything. The college fund sat in trust, $157,000 that my grandmother had earmarked for my education. Specifically for my architecture degree. Specifically for the life I'd already begun planning, filled with historical preservation and restoration work that would honor everything she'd taught me about legacy and craft. Victoria was supposed to transfer the final payment to my university account. Victoria, who was 5 years older, who'd already managed to talk our parents into funding her failed jewelry boutique, her failed yoga certification, her failed marriage. Victoria, who had a husband named Derek, all flash and rage, the kind of man who made our father uncomfortable and our mother nervous. Victoria, who gambled. I didn't know about the gambling then. None of us did. We wouldn't know for 13 years. It started small, poker games with Derek's friends, weekend trips to Atlantic City, the kind of fun that couples do together. But Victoria's version of fun had teeth. By the time I was being rejected by my first college choice, the rejection letter still baffled me because my grades were flawless. Victoria had already lost $70,000. By the time my backup universities sent acceptance letters, she'd lost more. By the time I was supposed to be registering for summer orientation, she'd lost everything. Including my everything. The forged documents were masterful. I'll give my sister that. She forged my signature with enough accuracy that even our parents, who'd known my handwriting their entire lives, didn't question it immediately. She created a false routing account for a European educational institution. She left breadcrumbs suggesting I'd been depressed, isolated, desperate to escape, all of which would have been red flags if anyone had bothered to ask me directly. But they didn't ask. They believed. The mortgage payment was due. The college fund was gone. The bank sent notices. Our parents' voices, which I'd never heard raised in anger directed at each other in my entire life, suddenly filled the house like a second presence. Aunt Victoria, that beautiful, practiced liar, sat at the dinner table with tears in her eyes and told the story of my betrayal so perfectly that even I started to question my own memory. She said she needed to find herself, Victoria said, her voice breaking. She said the pressure was too much. She said she was sorry but she had to go. I found the letter in her room. She said she'd sent the money to some alternative institute in France, that she needed time away from all of us. There was no letter, I said quietly. Of course there was, Victoria snapped, suddenly angry. Stop lying, Willow. Just stop. We know what you did. The isolation was immediate. My father, Henry, a man who'd never raised his voice to me in my life, looked at me with eyes that had gone cold and distant. My mother, Eleanor, pressed her hand to her chest as if my presence caused her physical pain. Aunt Victoria sat between them like an angel, the devoted daughter who discovered her sister's treachery, the loyal child who cared enough to protect the family's assets. Within a week I was gone. I worked 3 jobs my first year alone. McDonald's at dawn, a bookstore in the afternoon, a late-night shift cleaning offices in the financial district. I slept on my friend's couch, then 2 friends' couches when word got out that my family had abandoned me, then finally in a studio apartment the size of a closet in a neighborhood that wasn't safe but was what I could afford. I was angry in a way that burned cold, not hot. Rage that calcified into focus. During my shift at the bookstore, I started reading everything I could about historical architecture, about IP law, about how intellectual property was valued and authenticated. I bought used textbooks. I attended free lectures at the community college. I befriended a retired patent attorney who worked part-time shelving books, and during our breaks, I asked endless questions about how credentials worked, about what made something valuable, about the process of authentication and certification. "Why are you so interested in this?" he asked me once, setting down a stack of law books. "Because someone lied about something that mattered," I said. "And someday I'm going to make sure the truth is worth something." He studied me for a moment, this old man with kind eyes and a lifetime of understanding human nature. "The truth is usually worth something already," he said. "People just have to be smart enough to recognize it." I took the GED. I enrolled in night school at a state university, juggling my jobs and my classes like an acrobat on a wire, never falling, never breaking, just pushing through. I got my degree in history with a concentration in archives and authentication. I got certifications in IP appraisal, in historical document analysis, in conservation methodology. I built a company in secret, working out of a small office in a basement, taking on projects that required my growing expertise. Phoenix Restoration began as a whisper, word of mouth from the old attorney who'd watched me hunger for knowledge in the bookstore. I appraised estate collections. I authenticated rare documents. I built a reputation for absolute discretion and meticulous accuracy. By year 7 I was making 6 figures. By year 10 I was making more than most people in my hometown made in a lifetime. By year 13, I was one of 3 certified Emberstone IP specialists in the entire United States. The only one who still lived in the region. The only one who knew, because I'd spent those 13 years of exile researching every reference to Emberstone that existed in academic literature, patent offices, historical societies, and architectural archives, exactly how valuable that formula was. Emberstone had been used in the restoration of the Biltmore Estate, the Plaza Hotel in New York, the Boston Public Library. It was a material that commanded premium prices for its fire resistance, its aesthetic qualities, its historical authenticity. The IP holder could license that formula for millions. But the IP holder needed authentication. They needed a certified specialist to verify the original formulas, to document the chain of custody, to prove the legitimacy of the intellectual property claim. Without that certification, the IP was technically worthless. The archive was sitting in my parents' cramped rental house, and they didn't even know they were sitting on a fortune. The cruelest joke, I was the only person qualified to unlock it. My father's voice on the phone was a ghost of itself. 13 years of silence, and then suddenly this thin, hollow version of a man I barely remembered. "Willow?" He said it like a question, like he was testing the sound of my name on his tongue. I didn't answer immediately. I was sitting in my office, my real office, a corner suite in a building downtown with my name on the door, with credentials on the wall, with 12 employees and a reputation that extended across 6 states. I let him sit with the weight of my silence. "Your mother," he began, then stopped. "The house. We have to move again. The owners are selling and we can't." He stopped again. I heard the sound of him struggling. "We need help, Willow. I know we have no right to ask." I could have hung up. I could have deleted his number and gone back to my dinner reservation, to the life I'd built in the 13 years they'd cut me out of. I could have let them go bankrupt with the secrets they didn't even know they possessed. But I'm my grandmother's granddaughter, and she taught me something about legacy. "Where do you want to meet?" I asked. The rental house on Maple Street was the physical manifestation of my parents' fall from grace. The columns of the Vance estate had been replaced by chipped clapboard siding. The sweeping oak trees had been replaced by a struggling shrub that hadn't been watered in weeks. The grand foyer had been replaced by a cramped living room where the furniture was too big for the space and the air hung heavy with the smell of mold and the particular depression of people who'd once had everything and had learned, against their will, to have nothing. My mother was in the kitchen when I arrived. I heard her first, the gasp of recognition, the sound of a woman who'd just realized the daughter she'd spent 13 years erasing was standing in her home. Victoria came out of the back bedroom like a predator smelling blood. She hadn't changed much. Still beautiful in that calculated way, still wearing her hair and her makeup and her smile like weapons. But there was something harder in her face now, something that looked like bitterness wearing the mask of sophistication. "Well," she said, leaning against the doorframe in the exact spot where I'd stood 13 years earlier, the outsider in my own family. "Look who crawled back. The family traitor." Her eyes traveled over my designer suit, my leather shoes, My expensive haircut. I watched her recalibrate. Or have you finally learned to live an honest life? I said nothing. I simply looked at her, at the woman who'd stolen my future, who'd spent 13 years rewrapping that theft and gaslighting in lies, who'd convinced my parents that my ruin was their mercy. The archive, I said finally, looking past her to my father, who'd followed Victoria out of the bedroom. He looked smaller than I remembered, like 13 years of guilt had worn him down to the bare bones. Your father mentioned needing to liquidate a family asset. Victoria's expression shifted. Predatory. She thought she'd won, I realized. She thought my return meant I'd come begging, that I needed them, that 13 years hadn't changed the fundamental power dynamic. She was wrong about so much. They'd stored the archive in the garage, of course. Not the main room, the actual space where family gathered, but the garage treated like the junk Victoria had always insisted it was. The trunk was exactly as I remembered it from the last time I'd opened it at 7 years old. Ornate brass fixtures, leather corners worn soft with age, the kind of beautiful craftsmanship that came from an era when things were built to last centuries, not seasons. I knelt beside it and breathed in the scent of old paper, old leather, old history. For a moment, I let myself feel it, the weight of 13 years, the echo of my grandmother's voice, the burning clarity of purpose. We hired an appraiser, Victoria said behind me, trying to regain control of the narrative. But he said the documents were too old and confusing to value. We thought maybe you could find someone to buy them. For the estate sale, you know. The lie in her voice was so familiar it almost felt like home. I'll need 3 days, I said, standing, to properly examine the collection. The value is in the details. I need quiet. Don't waste our time, Victoria snapped. Just list it on eBay. I found a dealer who's interested, Mr. Smith from the antiques shop downtown. He offered $10,000. I smiled at her then, a real smile, the first one I'd allowed myself in 13 years. I need quiet, I repeated. I locked the trunk and carried it inside. My mother had set up a room for me, the second bedroom, guest bed with clean sheets, like I was a stranger passing through. I left the suitcase I'd packed in the trunk of my car untouched and instead set up my portable conservation station in the garage, the one I used for high-value appraisals. Thin gloves. White mask. The precise instruments of my profession. The archive had been sealed for 13 years. The climate control had been non-existent. The basement of the Vance estate, then the attic of their rental house. But the leather binding and the paper quality were exceptional. My grandmother's great-grandfather had understood preservation. I worked through the night while my parents slept, while Victoria, who'd arrived early that morning with Derek in tow, snored in the bedroom next to mine. I worked with the precision of a surgeon and the reverence of a believer, opening each ledger, photographing each page, documenting each formula. The Emberstone compounds were exactly as my grandmother had described them. Chemical formulas for a silicate-based stone composite, developed in 1887, perfected over 2 decades. Records of testing. Documentation of the material's fire resistance, its aesthetic qualities, its unique color variation process. Everything a certified specialist would need to authenticate the IP claim. But it was a folded deed tucked inside the final ledger that made me stop. The deed dated from 1910. The handwriting was old, precise, belonging to an era when property and IP were documented with the same careful language. I held it up to the light and read the careful Victorian script, my hands beginning to shake. Perpetual Management Clause. The original proprietor of the Emberstone composition retains sole legal authority over the licensing and commercial utilization of said formula in perpetuity, with authority transferable only to direct descendants or designated heirs through proper channels of inheritance or assignment. I set the deed down carefully. Then I kept looking. The bank statement was wedged between 2 deeds, like someone had deliberately hidden it there decades ago, trusting that someday someone would find it. It was dated 13 years ago, the month I was erased. The transfer was for $150,000. The destination was not a European bank. It was an offshore account in the name of Victoria Vance Holding. I sat back on my heels, my heart moving through several distinct emotions in rapid succession. Shock, then certainty, then a cold, clean rage that felt like purpose crystallizing into form. The proof was in my hands. 13 years of being called a liar, a thief, a selfish failure. 13 years of isolation and hunger and rebuilding myself from ashes. 13 years of not knowing if the lie I'd been accused of was somehow true, if somehow I'd blacked out and stolen from my family, if somehow I deserved to be erased. All of it, every doubt, every lonely night, every moment of wondering if maybe I was the problem, was sitting in this folder, authenticated by the passage of time and the carelessness of a woman who'd never believed she'd be caught. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I carefully photographed the statement. I photographed the deed. I photographed the perpetual management clause. And I began to plan. Victoria came into the garage the next morning, moving like she owned the space. She was wearing yoga pants and a designer tank top, the uniform of a woman who'd never had to work for anything in her life. Derek was somewhere in the house. I'd heard him stumbling around the kitchen, helping himself to coffee with the entitlement of someone who believed the world existed for his convenience. You know, she said, leaning against the doorframe in the way she'd perfected, Mom and Dad actually feel bad for you. All alone. It's sad. She said it like she was granting me a favor by acknowledging my sadness. If you'd just been honest 13 years ago, maybe they wouldn't have lost the estate. You just have to accept responsibility for what you did. I paused my work. I looked up at her. And I let her see exactly what I wanted her to see. A woman broken by time, still bearing the weight of accusations that had hollowed her out. You're right, Victoria, I said quietly. It was irresponsible of me. I watched her chest puff out with pride. She loved this. She'd waited 13 years for this moment, for her sister to crumble under the weight of the lie and finally accept the narrative Victoria had built. I'm glad you're finally understanding, Victoria said, with the false kindness of a predator who just confirmed its prey was weakened. It's good for everyone if we can all just move forward. Yes, I said, still looking at my work. Forward. She left the garage satisfied. That was when I called Marcus, my IP lawyer, the brilliant man who'd helped me build Phoenix Restoration into the powerhouse it had become. The archive contains the original Emberstone IP, I told him quietly. And there's a perpetual management clause dating to 1910 that grants the IP holder, whoever controls the archive, sole legal authority over licensing and commercial utilization. You're going to claim it? Marcus said. It wasn't a question. I'm going to execute a hostile IP transfer, I corrected him. I'm going to authenticate the IP, assert the perpetual management clause, and legally assume management control based on my status as the rightful heir. There was a pause. Then Marcus started laughing, not mockingly, but with the genuine delight of a man who just realized the scale of what was about to happen. Willow, he said, that's going to be beautiful. Victoria announced the sale on the second day. Mr. Smith from the downtown antique shop had agreed to her asking price, $10,000. My parents were overjoyed, enough for the security deposit on a new apartment, enough for the first month's rent, enough to believe they might escape their cramped rental house. Victoria glowed, accepting their gratitude like she'd just saved them all. I walked into the living room calmly. My parents and Victoria were sitting on the faded sofa, a contract spread out on the coffee table between them. That's wonderful news, I said, my voice carefully modulated. But before the sale completes, there's a legal requirement I should mention. Victoria's head snapped up. What requirement? The buyer's contract requires a certified Emberstone IP valuation, I said, moving to the chair across from them. It's standard for any antique architectural materials over 100 years old, especially materials with potential IP implications. The buyer needs to know the historical context, the authenticity of the formulas, the chain of custody. It's a protection for both parties. What is Emberstone? My mother asked, confused. A historical building material developed by the Vance family, I explained. Quite rare. Quite valuable to the right collector or institution. The buyer will need my certification before they can proceed with the purchase. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. You're saying the deal won't go through without your signature? I'm saying the deal won't be legally binding without the proper valuation, I corrected her. It's not my preference. It's contract law. I pulled out the amendment, the one I'd had Marcus quietly add to the standard contract template. Victoria had signed it without reading, of course she had. My sister had never believed the small print mattered. Show me, Victoria demanded. I pointed to Clause 7, subsection B. Sale shall not be deemed complete or transferable until a certified IP appraiser licensed by the National Archives Authentication Board has provided written certification of historical authenticity and IP status for all materials containing intellectual property elements over 50 years in age. This is insane, Victoria said, but I could see the moment her mind shifted. She was trapped. She needed my certification to complete her $10,000 sale. She had to swallow her pride and come to me. It happened faster than I expected. By that evening she cornered me in the kitchen. Willow, she said, and her voice had transformed. No more contempt, no more false kindness. Just desperation. I need you to sign off on this valuation. What do you need? Money? I'll split the $10,000 with you. $5,000. That's more than you've probably made in months. The irony was so thick I could taste it. My sister, offering me $5,000 from a sale of property that contained formulas worth millions, formulas that should have been mine all along, formulas that my grandmother had trusted to this family with sacred faith. I didn't smile. Not yet. I need something else, I said. For the valuation, I need access to the full legal history of the original Vance estate sale. Every document, including the mortgage disbursement records from 13 years ago. The buyer's appraiser requires historical context. They want to verify that nothing in the sale was legally contested. Victoria went very still. I watched her do the calculation, watched her decide whether this was a trap. Why would they need that? She asked slowly. Because the Emberstone IP is potentially subject to inheritance law, I said, which wasn't technically untrue. The buyer's insurance company wants to ensure there are no claims against the formula from other family members. It's a protection for them. It was the kind of lie that was just true enough to be believed by someone desperate to believe it. Victoria opened her mouth, closed it. Then she nodded. There's a box in the hallway closet. Old financial records. Take what you need. She left the kitchen, her earlier confidence shattered. The closing was set for a Thursday morning. Mr. Smith was coming to the house to finalize the sale and pick up the archive. My parents had new hope in their eyes for the first time in 13 years. Not hope that their situation would improve, but hope that they could at least escape the rental house, could take a step toward rebuilding something. Victoria was dressed in her best clothes, the ones she wore to feel important. Derek was nowhere to be found. He was, I'd learned, in Atlantic City, continuing the family tradition of gambling away money that didn't belong to him. I dressed differently. I wore a bespoke charcoal suit from a designer whose name meant money in the architectural and legal communities. I wore shoes that had been handcrafted in Milan. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings, the ones I'd managed to keep, the ones I'd sold for rent during year 3 and bought back during year 9, as a promise to myself that I would reclaim everything that belonged to me. I looked like exactly what I was, a woman who'd built something from nothing. A woman who had the power to reshape circumstances. A woman who was no longer broken. Mr. Smith arrived at 10 a.m. sharp, a small man with careful eyes and a leather briefcase. He'd come to pick up junk from a poor family. He had no idea he was walking into something that would become a story people told for years. I stood at the head of the table, not sat, stood, a position of power, and placed the bank statement in the center directly where everyone could see it. Before we proceed with the sale, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade, we need to address the $150,000 theft that destroyed this family 13 years ago. The silence was the kind that has weight. Victoria's face went white. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father rose slowly, understanding beginning to dawn on his features. This is a receipt, I continued, pointing to the statement, for a transfer of my college fund to an offshore account in the name of Victoria Vance Holding. Dated 13 years ago. 2 weeks before I was accused of stealing it. Those papers could be forged, Victoria said desperately. Willow, you have no idea what you're... I also have this, I interrupted, placing the perpetual management clause on the table. A deed from 1910 tucked inside the archive, granting the IP holder absolute authority over the Emberstone licensing. And I have my certification. I pulled out the certificate of IP transfer, the document that Marcus had prepared, the one that made me the legal manager and owner of the Emberstone intellectual property, based on the archive's authentication and my lineage as the rightful heir designated by my grandmother. The archive is not junk, Father, I said, looking directly at him. It is the key to a multi-million-dollar architectural brand. The formulas are authentic. The chain of custody is verified. And under the perpetual management clause, I, as the certified IP appraiser and direct descendant of the original proprietor, have just legally transferred management and ownership to myself and my company, Phoenix Restoration. I turned to Victoria. She was already reaching for the papers, but I was faster. I held them up, keeping them out of reach. You lose the archive, I said, my voice quiet but absolute. You lose the credit. You lose the false life you've been building on my ruin. And the bank is very interested in the offshore account transfer, Mother and Father. I've been in contact with them. I hadn't, not yet. But I would. Before the day was done, Marcus would file the complaint. The statute of limitations on fraud this severe extended much further than 13 years when the crime was actively being concealed. Willow, my mother began, her voice breaking. I didn't wait to hear what she had to say. I picked up the archive, walked past Victoria, who looked like she was going to collapse, past my father, who'd aged a decade in 3 seconds, past my mother with her hand still pressed to her chest. You stole 13 years from me, I said at the door, my voice steady. You stole my future. You stole my education, my safety, my family. You spent 13 years convincing them I was a lie, and I spent 13 years building something real. My grandmother was right. These documents matter. They always did. They were worth everything. And now they're mine. I walked out of that miserable house and into the autumn sunshine. Mr. Smith followed me along with Marcus, who'd been waiting in the car outside. We didn't go back in. The Emberstone IP transfer was validated. The offshore account was traced. Victoria was indicted on charges of wire fraud, theft, and filing false financial documents. Derek's name appeared on several of the offshore account transfers. It turned out the gambling wasn't just Victoria's problem. They were facing substantial prison time, assuming their lawyers could negotiate a deal that didn't include the full extent of the charges. My parents moved into a small but genuine home, purchased through my decision to split my first licensing payment with them. I did it not because I forgave them. Forgiveness was a luxury I hadn't yet decided whether to afford, but because they were still my parents and my grandmother would have wanted me to acknowledge that some family bonds persist beyond the damage done to them. Phoenix Restoration became the primary licensing agent for the Emberstone IP. The formulas were authenticated, documented, and released for use by qualified restoration companies. The licensing revenue exceeded projections by 400%. I hired an architect to lead the restoration division, a brilliant woman named Sarah who understood that the best work honors the past while building the future. I hired historians, chemists, and specialists. I built something not just profitable but meaningful. My father asked to see me 6 months after I'd walked out of the rental house. We met at a coffee shop, neutral territory. He looked smaller in person, diminished by 13 years of believing a lie. But he also looked honest, like he'd finally started the work of understanding what he'd done, what he'd believed without question, what he'd destroyed in the process. I was afraid, he said, not looking at me. When Victoria told us what you'd done, I was so afraid. We were losing everything, and she made it so easy to believe that it was someone else's fault. She made it so easy to be angry at you instead of at the bank, at the circumstance, at my own failure to protect us. I said nothing. I drank my coffee. That doesn't excuse what we did, he continued. It doesn't excuse what I believed without asking you a single question. But I want you to know that I know now. Your mother knows now. And I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't undo 13 years. Sorry doesn't return the opportunities stolen, the family gatherings missed, the isolation endured. But sorry, I was learning, was sometimes the only thing left when everything else had been lost. I didn't hug him. But I did agree to family dinner the following month. The story of the Vance Estate's collapse and restoration became something of a legend in architectural circles. The Emberstone IP had been purchased by a major restoration company that used it to restore 3 historic sites. My authentication process became the industry standard for verifying historical IP claims. I was invited to speak at universities, to consult on authenticity questions, to be the person who made the definitive call on whether an archive mattered. I was, in other words, successful. But success felt different than I'd imagined it when I was sleeping on couches and working 3 jobs and believing that vindication would taste like victory. Vindication, I learned, tastes more like complication. Victoria was convicted on 5 counts of wire fraud. She was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. My mother wept at the sentencing. My father sat stone-faced. I didn't go, I was building something, and the space where I once would have gone to watch my sister's ruin was now occupied by work that mattered to me more than revenge ever could. Derek received a longer sentence. The offshore accounts had been more extensive, more sophisticated, than anyone initially realized. My parents apologized in the way people apologize when they've finally understood the weight of what they've done. I accepted the apology in the way people accept apologies when they've finally understood that holding on to anger is just another way of staying chained to the past. We weren't a close family. But we became, over time, a real one. The archive sits now in a climate-controlled vault beneath Phoenix Restoration's headquarters, protected by insurance and security and the absolute reverence of a woman who understands what was almost lost. Sometimes I go down there after hours and I open my grandmother's ledgers. I read her great-grandfather's careful handwriting. I understand, more fully with each passing year, that he wasn't just documenting a formula, he was creating something that could last. Something that could matter. Something that could be inherited by people who understood its value. I understood. The Emberstone formulas are being used now to restore the next generation of historic structures. The IP revenue has funded my expansion into 6 other regions. The company has become, exactly as I once dreamed, a vehicle for preserving history while honoring the people who'd created it. But the real victory wasn't the money or the IP transfer, or even watching Victoria's face when she understood that she'd lost. The real victory was smaller and quieter. It was the moment I understood that my grandmother hadn't just been teaching me about history. She'd been teaching me about inheritance, not the kind that lives in bank accounts and property deeds, but the kind that lives in how we choose to build our lives, in what we decide matters, in the difference between a life lived in reaction to betrayal and a life built in honor of something real. My grandmother taught me that the greatest revenge isn't destroying what destroyed you. It's creating something so beautiful and so real that it makes the destruction seem small by comparison. If you've made it this far, you understand, respect is non-negotiable. My worth wasn't defined by Victor's seating chart or the bonus he stole from my mother's care. My story proves that silence was a weapon, letting me bury the Apex Core IP and the kill switch right under his arrogant nose. If this resonated, share it with someone who's been gaslit into invisibility. Tell them, your silence doesn't make you weak. I didn't beg for my job back. I simply executed the system shutdown and took the COO seat he thought he deserved. The revolution happens when you decide to write your own ending. Your worth was never in question. Subscribe and hit that notification bell for more stories about turning humiliation into triumph. Share your story below.